Welcome, and welcome to Advent. Advent, as you might know, is the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas, and it's a season for preparing ourselves to celebrate Jesus' first arrival on earth. And since we're talking about arrivals, let me start with a story about an arrival. In the year maybe 2014. Now, this is a long time ago, so the details are a bit fuzzy for me. In the year maybe 2014, my parents were set to arrive in Melbourne, flying in from Singapore to visit. And my sister and I, Lindy, who is actually here as well, were here on the other side, set to receive them. And in preparation, I checked the flight number, time of arrival, made sure we had the right day of the week, and my sister and I discussed whose car to take, what route would be best at that time in the morning, when we'd have to wake up and what time we'd have to set off. And the plan went really well. We reached the airport in good time and stood at the arrival gates with minutes to spare, right? We were chatting and relaxing. It was a good morning. But after a while, when the flight's wave of passengers came and went, we didn't see my parents. And we checked the website and there were no records of flight delays. So I called my dad. And when he picked up, I asked, I think, "Hey Dad, what time is your flight? It's supposed to be at about 9 a.m., right?" And he replied, yes, that's right, that's correct. Our flight should arrive about that time next week." And I thought, I see. In my preparation, I had double-checked the time, the date, and the day, but not the date. We arrived way too early to pick them up. So after a lot of embarrassed laughter, we did it again the week after. And this time, we got our parents successfully. Yes. And I'm wiser now, but the lesson here is, of course, don't be like past me. Prepare well, not poorly, when you know there's an arrival. So, Advent is a time when we prepare to celebrate Christ's first arrival, and we prepare to do so in many different ways. We might prepare physically, right, with presents and cards and food, or if you look around this room, lovely decorations. We might prepare mentally, looking forward towards celebrations, or maybe psyching ourselves up to manage the chaos if we're the ones hosting a gathering. And of course, Christians should prepare spiritually by slowing down, re-examining where our hearts are at, reflecting on our lives in relation to God's love and God's rule. And today, as part of our spiritual preparation, we're going to consider how Christ's first arrival reminds us that he will have a second arrival, as we heard in our reading. Now, these two arrivals are very different in nature, but they are also linked. And though we tend to think of them as separate events, Christmas and Jesus' second coming as separate events, they are, in a very real sense, one event, one giant divine act, one salvation plan, started at Jesus' birth and to be brought to its explosive conclusion upon his future return. So, that's what we're looking at today. And what does Jesus say about his second arrival? Like I said, the two arrivals could not be more different. At his birth, Jesus arrived in weakness as a baby, a human baby. But at his final return, Jesus says he will arrive with great power and glory. At his birth, Jesus was seen by only a few people, shepherds, the Magi. But at his final return, Jesus will be seen and known by absolutely everyone, for his arrival will shake the heavens. The sun, moon, and stars will be thrown into confusion as Jesus arrives on the scene in overwhelming power. Now, strangely, Jesus' glorious vision of the future in Mark chapter 13 does not list many of the things that we normally associate with, well, the end of the world. You might remember stuff from the Ezekiel series that we've done. The youth might remember stuff from Revelation that we've been looking at. But there's no mention of things like the defeat of God's enemies. There's no mention of judgment. There's no mention of the New Jerusalem and other things that we've heard this past year. Jesus only talks about two things: his coming glory and power, and about how he will gather his people to himself. It seems like that's Jesus' chief concern, that when he comes again, he will bring believers into full divine fellowship and union with himself, which is really the goal of him coming down as a child on Christmas in the first place. Remember that Jesus was called Emmanuel, God with us? At Christmas, he came down to be with us, and in the world's final destination, at the end of time, he will come to gather us to be with him. And union with God really is for Christians the realization of our ultimate hopes. Just imagine being in an everlasting state where evil is no more, where all sins are forgiven, where all debts are paid, and where all of our relationships, between us and God, between us and each other, between us and the rest of the created order, all these relationships are restored to what God intended from the beginning. All this healing and restoring, all this wonderful stuff, is what inevitably happens when we are united to the source of all good things. And Jesus tells us that his coming and doing all of this is not a possibility, but a certainty. Regardless of whatever happens to us or to the world, whatever turmoils of distress that get experienced, regardless of how it looks like evil has triumphed or is going to triumph, Jesus tells us today in Mark 13, in no uncertain terms, that God and his people will be the final victors in the end. Jesus' second arrival is something we should look forward to. It is a great and glorious end, and it's an invitation, actually, from Jesus to us to put our faith, hope, and love not in other people or things in this world, but to him alone who has surpassed all other things. And then after that, after describing his second arrival in these two ways, Jesus goes on to talk about how people should prepare for his second arrival. And whereas in my failed airport run, I should have double-checked the date, a person does not prepare for Jesus' second arrival by trying to figure out the date and time of the event. Our passage is quite clear that we will not know the time of the arrival. Verse 32, but the day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. At this point, though, I should probably explain what happened in the verses just before this, in the lesson from the fig tree, which seems to say almost the exact opposite, that we should see signs and know the seasons. In verse 28, as soon as the twigs get tender and its leaves come out, summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. And the important thing to note here is that these verses are most likely not talking about Jesus' second coming. And we can see this mainly because of verse 30, which tells us that Jesus' contemporaries, this generation, will not pass away until all these things have happened. Jesus has not yet come again, right? He's not come again? Yes, he hasn't. Because remember, his second arrival is going to be extremely obvious. He will not arrive by stealth. When Jesus comes again, we will know. But the people in Jesus' time, this generation, have certainly passed away at this point. So then, what could these verses 28 to 29, be referring to? What are these things? And what is it? These verses are most likely referring to the historic destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now, Mark chapter 13 is a bit of a difficult chapter to read because it's about Jesus telling his disciples in advance both about the end of the world and about the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. Because the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, Jesus uses kind of as a paradigm for what the end of the world will be like. So this generation in today's passage was certainly alive to witness the distress and horror of that event in 70 AD. So while his disciples were to see the signs and know that Jerusalem's time was near, there will be no such indication for Jesus' second coming. So, if we're not supposed to track the time or figure out the season or the dates, then what are Jesus' followers supposed to do? Well, Jesus says that we are to live faithfully in the present and to be ready at any hour for the return of the Master. Verse 33, be on guard, be alert. You do not know when that time will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house, puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned task, and tells one at the door to keep watch. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. If we are followers of Christ, will we be waiting idly for Jesus' second arrival? No, we won't be. Because each has his assigned task, whether it be loving our enemies, preaching the gospel, making disciples. There'll always be plenty to do. And regardless of the assigned task that is given to you, Jesus calls all of us to be alert, in a state of readiness or vigilance, because the Master can return at any time. This is both a call to faithfulness and a strong warning against neglect and sleeping on the job. It's an encouragement towards vigilance. Now, this section might come across as showing us God as some harsh taskmaster, out to sort of catch and trap tired watchmen who just appear when they're asleep. But remember what it is that Jesus is asking the watchmen to wait for. For the Christian, the return of the Master, Jesus' second coming, is not a threat to our well-being, but the true fulfillment of our hopes and dreams, of our very heart's desires. The attitude of the servants of the house isn't meant to be one of dreary work under pain of punishment, but loving devotion to a Master who has loved the servants infinitely greater first. While Christ has not yet come, we are to work in obedience to him, and as an expression of our love for him. And when Christ comes in glory to gather his elect and judge the world, Christians are to look forward to that with joyful anticipation. So with all these things, today's passage actually gives us quite a few bits to think about. There's a promise and a hope, right? Jesus certainly coming in glory and power, and that he will gather his people into the ultimate joyful union with him. But there's also a command and a warning to live readily and faithfully in the present, but to remain vigilant. And as we go through the Advent weeks ahead, it is good for us to wonder to ourselves about these things. Right? What do you think about Jesus' promise of his return? What about his call to live in a state of readiness and vigilance? Where do you place your faith, your hope? Is it in him or is it elsewhere? Let me propose something that may or may not sound a bit obvious, but the more that we love Jesus and put our faith and trust in him, the more meaningful Christmas as a celebration is going to be for us. What happens when a person doesn't think about Jesus at all? Well, then Christmas becomes a commercial holiday. Later this evening, the All Saints Youth will put on a skit about a man for whom Christmas was not only meaningless, but in fact burdensome, because he had forgotten about Christ. What happens to him? Join us later at 5:30 p.m. to find out. What about if the extent of someone's knowledge is that Christmas is Jesus' birthday, but not really much more than that? Well, in all likelihood, they'll still end up with a rather superficial or shallow celebration. The more that our ultimate hope and love is in Jesus, the more meaningful Christmas will be. And this was true even of the very first Christmas. In the New Testament, there's an old man named Simeon, and he saw the baby Jesus and rejoiced not just because Jesus was born, but because he looked forward in hope to what Jesus had come to do. Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. In other words, I can now die happy. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, the light for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel." Simeon looked at Jesus and saw not just a baby, but salvation of the whole world. And similarly, other faithful Israelites, like a prophetess Anna and priest Zechariah, they all rejoiced in God because they saw not just a baby, but something far greater. They saw God moving, enacting his great plan to save his world and his people that he had been foretelling for centuries in the Old Testament. Their praise and joy came from their hope and love of God meeting in Jesus' arrival. Where do you place your faith and your hope and your love? Is it in Jesus, or is it somewhere else? In this Advent season, may we come to place or replace those things in him.